Good afternoon, everybody. I am excited today to talk to you about your swim technique and specifically talking about distance per stroke or the number of strokes that you take per length and the assessment of that. And then how are we going to incorporate drills and swim sets in order to make changes to your distance per stroke. Okay, so one thing I want to highlight here, though, is that, of course, we're trying to make improvements in your performance, but you really need to be able to couple this conversation about distance per stroke with stroke rate. They go hand in hand, and in order to make those improved performances, you really need to look at how distance per stroke and stroke rate affect one another in order to make these changes happen. So certainly look at the stroke rate presentation that I have created and review that information in coordination with this information so that you have a complete understanding of both concepts. That way, when you begin to make changes, you'll make changes to both or either or in order to enhance your performance. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're talking about distance per stroke today. And distance per stroke really is the distance you travel each stroke. It's typically measured by the number of strokes that you take per length. That is by far the easiest way to do that. And again, just to reiterate the idea of stroke rate and coupling with this conversation, distance per stroke is really defined as the number of strokes you take per minute. Okay, so when you look at distance per stroke, what does that look like in terms of a good distance per stroke, or something that's really long or something that's really short? And you can see that here. The person on the left has a very long distance per stroke, and of course one of the characteristics of that, which I discuss later, is a very low stroke rate. Okay, on the other hand, a very short distance per stroke, which is shown here on the right, typically has a characteristic of a very high stroke rate. High stroke rate may not be excessively high, but it is high relative to how effective your distance per stroke is. Okay, so with those characteristics in mind, those two visuals in mind, let's talk about the purpose for making changes to your distance per stroke. The first and foremost is the changes to your arm and extension or reach. You'll also make changes to body rotation, the finish of your stroke. Are you finishing down past your hip or at your hip or before your hip? You're trying to make changes maybe to your kick efficiency, the timing of your kick relative to your catch, because remember the kick provides an anchor point for your catch to create more power. So that timing may need to be addressed. The timing of your breathing also may be of a concern. And then, of course, your stroke rate may need to be addressed along with that. That's not true in all cases. You may actually have a good distance or need to make corrections to your distance per stroke, but you have a good stroke rate. Okay, so that's really the reason behind making these corrections and the changes that need to be made. The concept here is that the changes to distance per stroke aren't just a matter of reaching further in the pool, letting yourself glide further. Let's say there's other elements that need to be addressed and changed, such as body rotation, your finish, kick efficiency, and so on, in order to make this happen. Okay, so distance per stroke correction. What are kind of the things that we need to address here? First is you need to address or assess your distance per stroke. How many strokes are you taking per length, per 25? That's what you need to assess, because that's how you're going to measure and count what your improvement is over the course of time. Then, of course, there are drills or swim sets really that will help you to make changes, and those include swim sets themselves, just literally the sets that you do every day. There are things in the way you can set up those sets to make changes to your distance per stroke. The use of paddles is a good way to increase your distance per stroke, and using drills such as the shoulder tap drill, and I'll cover that one specifically today in order to increase increase your distance per stroke. The paddles and the excuse me, and the shoulder tap drill are really designed around increasing your distance per stroke, which is the more common of the two issues. Most people don't have a propensity to have to reduce their distance per stroke. Occasionally, and I'll cover that information in this presentation, but most of the time people are trying to increase their distance per stroke. Okay, so let's first assess your distance per stroke. And that's simply basically counting the number of strokes you take in the length of a pool while you're doing some moderate efforts. And I definitely recommend that you do different distances, because your distance per stroke is likely going to change over those distances. And so I would just do a basic set that includes 2 50s at 10 seconds rest. Count your strokes per 25 for those. Do 2 150s, which is kind of a moderate distance set with 15 seconds rest. Count the stroke lengths for those, and do 2 times 300 with 30 seconds rest, and count the lengths per stroke for each one of those too. You average those per distance to come up with your distance per stroke, or the number of strokes that you have per length for the shorter effort, for the moderate, and for the longer effort. Because again, you'll find that those change. Oftentimes, the longer the sets get, the less or the more strokes you will take per length, which means your distance per stroke drops. So that's something to keep in mind as you go through and you're trying to make changes to the number of strokes you take each length. Okay, so once we've done that and we've established your general strength number of strokes you take per length for each one of those distances, we got to figure out what to do with that information, right? So you first start by understanding what the characteristics are of your distance per stroke, which relates to your stroke rate. Use a chart, and I'll show you that chart here in a minute. Excuse me, and include the goal distance per stroke in swim workouts depending on the swim distance. And I'll give you some workouts to utilize the information you get from the assessment tool and from the chart, and how to incorporate those into the swim workouts. Certainly be sure that you consider your pace per 100 and your stroke rate when you're making changes to your distance per stroke. Because you cannot affect, most times you don't want to necessarily affect, or you will affect your pace and your stroke rate when you're making changes to your distance per stroke. Okay, all right. So let's talk about the characteristics of distance per stroke. So let's say you have a shorter distance per stroke, and which really means that you're taking more strokes per length. Okay, so what does that mean? Typically, that means that your stroke rate is very high. Okay, maybe as high as 85 or greater. It's not necessarily always true, but in general, you have a higher stroke rate. Okay, the goal here is to really reduce your catch and pull on the water. You have a reduced catch and pull in the water, which means that's why you have a shorter distance per stroke. A very poor finish means you're finishing before your hip or through the pull phase. You're under rotated. You have poor rotation through the hips and shoulders, and typically the number of strokes per 25 is very high, usually 25 or higher. And I'll show you that in a chart form here in a minute. So that's kind of some characteristics of what a shorter distance per stroke looks like. Obviously, the goal is to increase your distance per stroke or have less strokes per length. Okay, now the opposite. Let's say you have a longer distance per stroke where there's less strokes per length. Typically, that means that your stroke rate is low. I put the number here of less than 55. That's not always the case. In general, it just means that your stroke rate is slow, which may mean that you have dead spots. Dead spots are really spots where there is no mechanical rotation of the arms to create propulsion. And so that becomes an issue, when you're addressing longer distance per stroke. If you have a weak catch or pull phase, typically you're over rotating when you have a long distance per stroke, and that's due to the timing of your breath and how long it takes you to go through that rotation. Typically, you have a low number of strokes per 25. Typically, it's less than 15. That's not always the case. In general, it just means that you have a low number of strokes per 25. So the goal when you have a long distance stroke is to shorten the distance of stroke or to have more strokes per length, per 25. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Two different opposite characteristics of either a short distance per stroke or a long distance per stroke. And knowing those characteristics will help you make changes to understand what your particular distance per stroke is like and what changes that need to be made in order to make improvements to your performance. So this is that chart I've mentioned several times, and really you're looking at what stroke length you should be making based off of height. And this is a pretty good tool to use. And so you can see here that the number of strokes on the left versus how tall you are on the bottom here. And you can see somebody who's around 175 centimeters in height could have a stroke length or distance per stroke, or the number of strokes per 25, around 17 all the way up to around 21. So if you fall within this range, that's good. Typically, you're within a normal range, and you don't necessarily need to make effective changes to the number of strokes you take per length. But again, if you fall towards the bottom end of this range, I would consider making changes to it. Actually, falling in the middle is kind of is more the ideal. So if you're at the bottom, you may consider trying to change it so you fall in the middle. If you're towards the top of the range, you may drop to get towards the middle. But again, overall, if you're within this range, then you don't necessarily need to make changes to your distance per stroke or number of strokes you take per length. And again, stroke rate and how fast you're swimming will certainly come into play when you're trying to make changes to your distance per stroke. Okay, so let's talk about making corrections to your distance per stroke. What do we do to make that happen? Let's first start with swim sets. So these are sets that you would purposely do to make increases to your distance per stroke. And when you're doing these sets, there's a couple of mechanical things that you need to focus on in order to make that happen. First, increase your body roll, particularly driving from the hips. Make sure that you have a longer gliding extension or reach. This will help delay your catch, and make sure that you have a very complete pull finish, that your hand, your thumb is going well past your hip to finish out that pull phase. Okay, so that's some mechanical things that need to be changed in order to increase this distance per stroke. And as you're doing those, or as you're doing these sets listed here, think about those mechanical changes in order to make those changes to your distance per stroke. So you can do 8 times 25, 4 times 50. Usually the sets are fairly low in distance. And for each of those 25s in these sets, count the number of strokes. And when you do 25s, typically try to use 1 to 2 strokes less per 25 than what you establish as your standard. If you're doing 50s, maybe 2 to 3 strokes per 50 less than what you consider standard. So you're increasing the distance per stroke, which means that you are trying to reduce the number of strokes per length. And you do that by changing these mechanical elements of your swim stroke in order to make that happen. But let's say you want to decrease your distance per stroke, which means that you want to increase the number of strokes you take per length, which is not very common, but it does occur. Okay. In these sets, focus on less body roll, shortening your glide or reach. engage your catch earlier, may actually have more of a downward angle to your entry and your reach phase, and finish earlier in your pull. Finish right at the hip, or maybe even just before the hip when you finish out your pull phase. Again, vary the intensity of your sets just like you did previously. Do it in 25s or 50, and this time around, instead of decreasing the number of strokes per 25, you're actually increasing the number of strokes per 25. For 25 sets, you may increase that by 1 to 2 strokes per 25. If you're doing 50s, maybe increase it by 2 to 3 strokes per 50. The overall goal here really is that you're increasing the number of strokes because you have such a long distance per stroke. So, okay. So, let's move on to paddles. So, paddles are a great way to increase your distance per stroke, really then lowering the number of strokes that you take per 25. Again, mechanical changes need to be made in your swim form in order to make this happen. So you're increasing your distance per stroke, which means that you need to have greater hip drive, longer reach, more of a delayed catch, and a very complete pull finish. Again, finishing past your hip. And you'll notice when you do these, focus on these elements, particularly with paddles, which accentuate all the movements in your swim and all the form elements of your swim, that you will really gain a lot of change in your distance per stroke. So when you're using paddles, some of the things or sets that I recommend are 3 times 200 at moderate effort or 2 times 400 at moderate effort. And trying to make sure that you don't necessarily count the number of strokes, because with paddles, typically your distance per stroke increases, which means that the number of strokes per 25 decreases automatically. The goal is just to really focus more on the mechanics in order to make those changes happen. A couple of characteristics, though, of using paddles as you are trying to make changes to your distance per stroke, or just in general, is try to make sure that the sets that you do in any given swim are not more than 1,000 yards using paddles. This helps protect against shoulder injury, and only complete about 1 to 2 swim sets using paddles per week while you're trying to make changes to your distance per stroke. Once you feel like those changes are established and you're making good progress, then I would certainly only do maybe 1 swim per week with paddles, and again, keeping under that 1,000 yards, or maybe 1 set every other week. Okay. All right. But we also have a drill, a shoulder tap drill, which is a good way to change your distance per stroke. Really, you're trying to increase your distance per stroke when you do this, which means that you're decreasing the number of strokes per length. The shoulder tap drill is a very good drill for doing this because it really focuses on slow turnover. You're going to tap the shoulder during your recovery phase of this drill, which means that your forward arm is extended out in front of you, and it stays extended through this slow turnover. So that's where the main focus is in terms of increasing your distance per stroke. Arms maintained close to the body, high elbow position, and the goal here really is, again, focusing on that forward arm, making sure the elbow doesn't drop and that it's more parallel to the bottom of the pool. So I want to show you what that drill looks like so you understand
swim drills are a vital part of every well-crafted swim set. I'm TriDoc coach and resident physiology specialist, Jeff Rains. And this is my good friend, 3-time Olympian, Brendan Hansen. So with me on deck and Brendan in the pool, today we're going to show you the shoulder tap drill. The purpose is to help develop body roll and high elbow recovery. This drill is best done using fins. Begin with normal freestyle stroke. With your right arm extended at the front of the stroke, initiate the over water recovery phase of the stroke with the left arm. When the left hand passes the shoulder, pause briefly and tap the shoulder before piercing the left hand into the water. Some tidbits. Focus on control and good body roll as you tap the shoulder through the recovery stage. Maintain the extended position while the opposite arm and hand enters the water in the front quadrant. This will look like normal freestyle swimming, but with a quick pause to briefly tap the shoulder.
Okay, so in that video, good drill to be able to increase your distance per stroke. And you can see the relationship there. In the video, they mentioned that it's really designed for increasing body roll and high elbow recovery, but it's also great for increasing distance per stroke because that forward arm has to remain extended through the drill. Okay, let's talk about distance per stroke and the swim sets that you might engage in during your workouts and how the distance per stroke will change with that in that regard. So when you have established your distance per stroke, kind of that sweet spot for you, and when you start to do swim sets and you're going to focus on distance per stroke during any given swim workout, if you do any sets that are less than 100, consider increasing the number of strokes by 2 to 4. And if you are doing sets of 125 to 200, increase it by 1 to 2. If you're doing sets of 200 yards or more, I would just recommend you use the established distance per stroke. That way you wind up re-emphasizing what you've already established. And that's really if you are wanting to increase your distance per stroke. If you want to decrease your distance per stroke, then the opposite is true, and you would just decrease the number of strokes per length for each one of these distances. In open water triathlon, just use your established distance per stroke. Since it's very difficult to kind of really know what a distance per stroke is out in open water, once you've established that in the pool and you've done a lot of sets and swimming workouts at that established distance per stroke, then you can really translate that into open water much better. Okay, so we've talked about all this information. We've talked about distance per stroke, how it relates to stroke rate, the things that you can do to change your distance per stroke mechanically. But when you've done all that and you begin to make improvements, what are some of the gains that you might expect? And obviously going to vary with everybody, but just keep this in mind through a lot of research that's been done by various organizations. If you're to improve your distance per stroke or reduce the number of strokes you take per length by just 1, so let's say you take 21 per length on average, if you can reduce that down to 20 on average and you keep a constant stroke rate, okay, you could see gains of 2 to 4 seconds per 100. That is very significant. So if you're, again, dropping from 21 to 20 per length and your rate, let's say, is 70 per minute, and if you can maintain that 70 per minute, even though you reduce the number of strokes per length, then you could definitely see some significant gains. So it's very important that one, these changes are made to your distance per stroke, but that they are also coupled with the stroke rate in order to make your improvements. Okay. All right. Lots of information. I know it can be maybe a little bit difficult to absorb. So I'm going to finish off by talking about distance per stroke or stroke rate in combination. That will help kind of, I think, help you kind of re-emphasize some of the information I've discussed here today. And the whole goal is to use what's known as a Swolf measurement, which is simply just swim and golf nomenclature combined together. And the whole concept of this is it's really measuring swimming efficiency by combining your stroke rate and distance per stroke. So the way this is done is you add the number of strokes taken in a pool length and the time it took you to swim that length. So example is if you swim at 25 and 30 seconds and you take 10 strokes, then you have a Swolf score of 40. Okay, but what does that mean? What is it? Why do we even do this? Really, the goal with doing Swolf is to measure that efficiency in kind of one packaged thing, a measurement tool, and the overall goal is to lower your score. So across different distances, then the goal is to lower the number of strokes per length, or lengthen your distance per stroke. And you do that by either lowering, by increasing your body rotation, having a longer reach, the timing of your catch relative to your kick. And again, the kick acts as an anchor to your catch. So by improving that, you can lower the number of strokes you take, and increasing your shoulder strength and flexibility. So that helps to just decrease the number of strokes per length. That's one way to lower your Swolf score. The other way is to just swim faster. But swimming faster doesn't mean that you just rotate your arms faster. I talked about a lot of information in the stroke rate presentation. So again, be sure to watch that relative to this conversation. To increase stroke rate, a couple of things just to keep in mind. Having a greater accelerated pull and recovery is important. Improve kick efficiency. There's other elements that go into that. So it's important that those get addressed in order to have a faster swim time, which will also help lower your score. So those two things, lowering your stroke rate and increasing your swim time, will improve your Swolf scores. But there's a lot of elements that go underneath both of those that need to be addressed, particularly relative to your technique and form, to help you change that score. Okay. All right, so let's talk about what that, or just briefly look at what that lower score might look like in the visual format. You can see the individual on the left, very long distance per stroke, which is, in terms of Swolf scores, which is great, but very slow swim time. Okay, have to find some balance between your distance per stroke and your swim time. So you have to have a faster turnover, which increases your distance per stroke, but you're swimming at a much faster rate, so you have a lower Swolf score overall between these two swimmers. Okay, Swolf considerations. Mentioned that the lower score, the better. There's no norms out there for you to compare against other swimmers. And you really can't do that just because there's so many variables between swimmers that don't really offer the ability to lower or to judge your score against others. It's great for you to use as a progress check for your own swimming efficiency and how you are changing your technique. And the way in which you're changing your form in order to improve these scores. And it's just a basic tool for judging improvement. Ultimately, you can see, you can look at each element of your swim, your rotation, your distance per, your your reach, your finish, your catch, pull, all those different phases. And all those phases come together and come out in this Swolf score. So it's a nice way to package all that together to see it in a more simplified manner, even though you got to make sure that you focus on each one of those elements in order to change these scores. Okay, again, kind of finish off here. No ultimate distance, no optimal distance per stroke or stroke rate for all swimmers. All of that's going to be based off experience, conditioning, how tall you are, what your flexibility is, biomechanics, and other factors all go into this idea of distance per stroke as it relates to stroke rate. So it's really up to you to kind of find ways in which to change your form and the technique that you have in order to make changes. So be sure to look at all the information you can on technique. I put out several different videos on technique and technique changes and how they relate to different elements of your swim form. So be sure to check those out and relate those back to making improvements in your distance per stroke and your stroke rate. Okay, I hope you got a lot of good information out of this presentation. And until next time.